alchemical synthesis of style and genre. It's underpinned by a kind of primeval groove and funk. It's offbeat, it's startlingly inventive, it's emotionally immediate. As well as being charged with a kind of electricity of ritual and nature, her work has taken inspiration from all kinds of sources: the architecture of Zaha Hadid, the work of Anselm Kiefer, and photography. And 2 operas, Between Worlds and Cave, crown an incredible body of work. Whatever scale that Tansy is working at, her music is always plugged into something essential and primal. It feels to me often like it draws something up from the earth, something atavistic and urgent, whether it's in the shamanic iris for soprano saxophone ensemble or her intricate string quartet, Nightingale's Ultra Deep Field, which was written for the Arditi Quartet, that sees a kind of cosmic perspective go hand in hand with bluegrass music. Her works have been championed internationally by incredible ensembles, world-leading ensembles: the London Symphony Orchestra, the BBC Symphony, Toronto Symphony Orchestra, BBC National Orchestra of Wales, New York Philharmonic, Ensemble Intercontemporain, and just this week, Asko Schoenberg, who premiered a new work with Clark Rundell, Canopies of Liquid Light. Her music has appeared at festivals including Märzmusik, Présence, Warsaw Autumn. She's been composer in residence at the Concertgebouw. She's taught the Royal Academy of Music and Bloomington School of Music in Indiana. And just last autumn, she was celebrated by the Ivors Academy as the recipient of their Outstanding Works Collection Prize. So, before we get on to discussing the premiere tonight, I wanted to ask Tansy a bit about her writing for voices in general. So she's written numerous works for voices: Christmas Eve for the choir of King's College, Cambridge, for 9 lessons and carols, a huge body of songs, and also these 2 acclaimed operas that I talked about. Next month, in fact, Emma Nikolovska, who's singing this evening, will be performing selections from Tansy's piece Troubadours for soprano and piano at Wigmore Hall. So, Tansy, what I wanted to ask you first of all was, what was your sort of journey into becoming a song composer?
It's a great question, and that journey perhaps started way back as a teenager when I was sort of caught in between taking various directions in music, and I suppose I still am in that place, but from a slightly different position, because it's always changing. But I'm always sort of questioning what to do in music, what to do next, and different things are exciting me at different times. But I've always loved the great singer-songwriters, and those of our time, let's say Joni Mitchell, Paul Simon. So I was interested in, I loved the idea at least of becoming some kind of singer-songwriter myself. So there's always been an interest in words and music, although I don't really think I ever had the confidence to create my own words. So in a way, the words just fell away, and the path I took, because I was looking for grand adventures. I do like an adventurous life, and that's what a life in contemporary music has brought me. So I was, as I say, caught between 3 ideas as a young person, and one was being a horn player, which I did for a few years, and the other was being a singer-songwriter, and the other was wild, epic, kind of transcendental journeys in notated contemporary music, and that's the one I got washed along into. So I didn't really write that much for voice for a time. When I was studying, I was really digging into technique, structure, creating new ways of composing, looking at trying to make my own unique kind of technique, creating codes in music, because I love the idea of the music holding secrets. So there's there's always a relationship with text, but it's kind of slightly hidden. And then later on, I had the wonderful opportunity to kind of dabble a bit with writing for classical singers. And it wasn't really until I started to work with the text of Nick Drake that a new kind of platform, a new level was kind of, I felt like I discovered that. But we can stop there because I could go on and on and on.
Well, I think we should talk a bit about Nick's words in a little while, but can you tell us a bit about this new project, the Ice Core Sample Says? Can you tell us who is speaking in the song and why?
Well, actually, this is very nice, kind of in the way that question links with what I was saying, because there's always been this lyricism in my music, but as I say, I took a journey out of that into something much more knotty and gnarly, because I was digging into what was possible in terms of composition. And so there's a kind of lyrical side, but there's also a really abstract, structural, kind of into the deep engineering of composition side of me. So there's these two sides. And it's hard to say which is the earthy and which is the kind of celestial, if you say there are always those aspects of my work. But I would say that the Ice Core Sample Says is actually a very nice kind of egalitarian relationship between my lyrical writing and my kind of catonic, earthly, slightly kind of out of this world type of composition. So it's actually a really nice balance of the two.
And I think with this, it feels like a really unique thing actually in song, which its traditions are kind of founded on a certain sort of romantic idea of the individual and all kinds of visions of, I suppose, kind of very sad young men wearing long coats, kind of wandering around in the wilderness in Germany. And I think we should talk about your relationship to that tradition a bit in a little while. But in the Ice Core Sample Says, what kind of story are you trying to tell?
Well, there are sort of, let's say, 3 voices, or 2.5 in a way. I wanted to depict the voice of the ice, so I'm trying to sort of encourage ice to kind of speak through some very icy piano music. So quite a long first section is a landscape, an icy landscape in the piano, which traverses some harmonic fields and harmonic patterns with kind of interjections which are quite kind of hard and rocky, let's say, from like a terrain, an Arctic terrain. And the voice sort of pulls a line which is not exactly lyrical, but it's trying to put a voice to the ice, and that's pulled out of this piano terrain for the first part. And that comes back later, but there's a second part where I wanted to zoom down to earth, as it were, and find the voice of humanity at this moment, the voice of now, the voice which is more recognizably lyrical. And the piano part then it sort of transforms ever so slightly into something which I describe as kind of AI Joni Mitchell, as I mentioned her earlier. But the reason I was thinking of Joni Mitchell is because I know that she's a real favorite artist of Nick Drake, so I wanted to support his words with my idea of what she might have done with it, perhaps. But anyway, I wanted to sort of do this, have this aspect of the cosmic kind of macro level, and then zooming down and trying to look at what the humans are making of all of this, and then zoom back up again, listen to the ice. And then there's a third section at the end, which is slightly more ritualistic. I'm not going to say any more than that, but I suppose it's an amalgamation of a human voice with an ice voice.
I think this is a really, the kind of scale you're talking about for song is really, really fascinating. Mainly because I've always thought of it as belonging in some sense to a kind of to the world of small rooms, doesn't it? You imagine Schubert performing Winterreise for his, baffled friends, way back when, and it belonging to a kind of that sort of scale in a way, that intimacy. But the text that you have from Nick and the kind of music you're writing seems to kind of explode that in all sorts of ways. I think we should sort of talk a bit about that, but I wanted to ask you a bit about Nick's words, and it's of course not the first time you set Nick's words. Nick Drake was the librettist for Between Worlds and for Cave, and I suppose I wanted to know what it is that you take from his words and what they kind of produce in you as a composer.
It's so hard to answer this question, but I'm going to try. I think his words are very direct and very simple, incredibly beautiful. At the same time, they hold great depth. And the words he gives to me, in fact, of course, have that quality. He does far more complex things when he's working with poetry, but he's brilliant at leaving space for the music. So I get these apparently superficial, no, not on the surface, it's light and full of love perhaps, but if you just listen a bit deeper, it's almost like you're burrowing down into the great depths of the earth, and likewise zooming up into the stratosphere. But that is left open to me to discover. But there's a very warm quality which has allowed me to find more warmth in the music as well, a more human aspect to the music, which I wasn't able to, well, I just didn't find that before. And I quite often leave a space in the music in the center, because I like very, very long chords which start very low and end up very high, if you think of them as vertical objects. And quite often there's this space in the middle if I'm writing for orchestra, which gives a very beautiful kind of resonance. But it's almost as if I leave that space for the voice, that's the voice register. But Nick's words just give a vessel for a part of me that I had left empty before. So it's a beautiful gift to a composer. So I suppose I wanted to, when I asked you initially about your kind of journey into song, you talked a bit about being a singer-songwriter yourself, and the people you've mentioned this evening, like Joni Mitchell. Of course, there's a lovely mention of Joni Mitchell in the score. It's a kind of sort of performance direction. But I was wondering how your work in song and the various different settings you've done for wonderful singers, do you see those relating to that kind of big romantic leader tradition that's represented by Schumann and Schubert and so on? I don't think I do. I love that music, but I don't think it's closely connected to my musical journey and my musical DNA. It's just a different world. So I guess I've been programmed differently. So I'm trying to traverse, as I say, this column of energy between the earth and the heavens, which many composers do, but the scale of it with me has a epic quality. Quite often, it's not, as you say, necessarily intimate for small spaces. It's, this piece is quite operatic, really. It's fairly ambitious.
And I suppose I wanted to ask you as well about how you think about writing for the voice as an instrument. One of your most wonderful works is Troubadours, that has at its center this figure of the troubadour, but I think is really, it's a really unusual work in that it's for soprano a cappella and just percussion. So it doesn't have that, I suppose, kind of harmonic cushion that you would have in I suppose, the great song tradition. And so there are lots of things that are used to create kind of mood, and I was wondering, there is a very exciting moment that will happen in the song this evening, which is a little bit kind of percussive, which you will hopefully enjoy. And I wondered if you had a kind of completely different sense of the voice as something more, as a different kind of instrument to how it's conceived traditionally, certainly in this kind of context where you have someone in black tie standing beside a piano.
Yeah, well, in fact, that reminds me of your previous question, because it took me a long time to come to the point of thinking about harmony in a kind of traditional way. I avoided that for a long time. I felt that I was a counterpoint composer, so I was always writing music in lines that are kind of separate lines, single lines, and then layers of lines that go from left to right, so to speak. And any harmony was kind of accidental. So I was not really inspired by the idea of writing for piano and voice in that traditional sense. And when I got the opportunity to start writing for voice, I was always just drawn back to the idea, what's the first human expression? Well, the voice. And what might the second one have been? Some sort of percussive sound. And so I always come back to these as the first sounds we would have made. And there's something about Truberitz which actually people do say you can hear a kind of strange harmony in the drum part as it progresses, so that's quite interesting. You start imagining things. But percussion and voice, I mean, I always say that of all the musicians, the great musicians in my life, of which there are many, there are more percussionists and singers than any. I love both animals. They're amazing.
And when you said that you feel the writing in this song, that it's operatic, what was it about having written for the operatic stage that you particularly took that's kind of shaped the way that you've expressed yourself in this and the way that you treat the voice? Do you think there's a big difference between that and, I mean, again, I suppose a kind of traditional leader writing?
Well, Emma has a very big voice, and I wanted to respond to that. Obviously, she has a very wide scope and she can be very intimate too, but having had such life-changing experiences in creating opera, that was what I was drawn to when I heard her voice and when I was searching for a text and I was looking for various things. And the poem is very demanding. It's big thoughts, it's big ideas. So yeah, I wanted to respond to that with something equally kind of spacious in a way. And a lot of my music is about creating space, and the poem is about these. It creates feelings of air and spaciousness, and that's something I'm very interested in music as well. So the grandeur of creating spaces is something I'm very interested in. The idea of inviting people into my imaginary space and hoping that it feels like a new space. I feel like imagination is like space anyway. We dream up new spaces all the time. So I try to do that in music. It's all about that. So that's why it's epic.
It's an epic song. I suppose I wanted to ask you as well about the piano writing and how you approach writing for that instrument. Of course, the piano, sort of following on from what you were saying about writing for the voice and thinking of this very fundamental relationship between, or the position of the voice and the percussive sound as sort of somehow fundamental to human music making. The piano, of course, is a percussion instrument in all sorts of ways. And how did you approach creating, what sorts of piano textures, I suppose, should we expect to hear in the piece, and how have you approached using it to create some of the things that you're talking about?
Well, I began with a series of chords, about 24 chords, I think, which I just created, and I didn't really know what I was going to do with. But I decided that I wanted to have a kind of feeling of something opening up, maybe opening and closing, but just a kind of repeated pattern, which is quite gentle in a way, but just spelling out these harmonic fields one by one. And that giving a kind of framework for the voice to emerge from. So that's how the piano works. It cycles these chords, but either side of these chords which go around, and they're placed kind of in the vocal range, in that middle range. I frame it with extremely high notes, which are slightly kind of aggressive, and extremely low notes as well. So it just opens up this big resonance. So the piano is also an orchestra here. But then when it goes into the more human realm, there are 4 layers of rhythmic patterns, and the pitches are hung onto these rhythmic patterns, and they sort of slowly evolve. But it's like 4 different timelines going on at once. So the pianist is doing something intensely rhythmical, but at the same time I wanted it to sort of depict ages of the eons in a way. And so it retains the quality of the kind of sharpness of these very high notes and very low notes at the end, but framing the harmonic field at the start, but it's slightly softened so that it becomes, as I said earlier, more reminiscent of pop song piano writing, but it's sort of through this filter of weirdness.
Sort of epic Simon and Garfunkel is the kind of aim that we're going for. I suppose as a kind of final thing to ask you, really, your music, and this could be at whatever scale, is really fascinated by, I suppose, what we might call kind of cosmic figures, but figures who exist either on some kind of borderland. So the shaman, I know, is a really important kind of muse for you, I suppose, in some ways. Your setting of John Clare, that's so wonderful. There you've identified a poet who, I mean, was a sort of true outsider and has this prophetic quality. I suppose I'm interested in, what do these figures represent to you? Why do they sort of permeate your music to such a degree?
Oh, I just love these magical figures, and I feel, for me, in music, they're very real, and that's my life. So, I live and breathe music, and there's a kind of intermediate area between music and voice. And I like to feel that, when I'm writing opera, I think, the music is telling some stories, and the singers are telling slightly different stories. But I love the idea that within that realm, there's also some voices which are absolutely in between. So it's almost like there are waves of music, and the crests of waves are these, what would the music say if it rose up then? And so I think that these mystical figures, which are also archetypes we reach back to in many sort of types of symbolism throughout the centuries, can be very powerful ways of helping us understand each other and ourselves. So, I think music is a very, very useful tool for that. So they're very important figures for me as this intermediary between realms.
It's a very interesting thing. I mean, when I was traveling here, I was thinking a little about, again, the epic scale of your music and the kind of cosmic imagination in this song in particular, the deep historical things, and trying to think back through the song tradition where we might find examples of that. And I thought of Schubert's Winterreise, perhaps unsurprisingly, where you have the crow, that extraordinary circling song, this only companion to the wanderer, but also the hurdy-gurdy man at the very end, who he asks, will you play your hurdy-gurdy to my songs, and that seemed to kind of open this door into that sort of space. I suppose as a very, very kind of final question, your music, it draws on so many different wellsprings. Sometimes I hear this kind of ooze of Harrison Birtwistle in there. Sometimes I hear Steve Reich. Sometimes I hear electronica and funk and dance music. Do you have a sense of kind of which part of Tansy Davies is kind of peeking out, part of your musical imagination is sort of peeking out in this song?
Yeah, I think this is a bit of a new adventure for me, this one. I'm working towards a very big project which will happen in a couple of years' time, which will be with an early music ensemble. So I suppose I'm just spinning around ideas in my mind with a view to moving towards that. So therefore, I'm trying to kind of simplify some aspects of my work because I don't really know how these ancient instruments work. So I'm trying to find some basic building blocks to work on. So, as I say, working on harmonic fields. So twisting and turning of very simple objects and finding a voice for something sort of very early human. That's what this one's doing, but it's maybe in the context with a vague imagining of early string instruments as well in the background. So it's my thing. It's my dreaming forward into what that might be, working with this kind of harmony, and at the same time this very weird pop music which I kind of invented for the human side. So that's a new element, and as I say, it's kind of AI journey.
I think there's something about that kind of mezzo-soprano sound that is sort of viola da gamba-ish in its way, isn't it? It's so gorgeous. Well, it just remains for me to say thank you to Tansy and invite you all to thank Tansy for being with us this evening, and I'm looking forward to all seeing you in the concert a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben.